This move, the English opening, immediately challenges black's central control and prepares for flexible development, often leading to d-pawn structures similar to the queen's pawn game but from a different angle. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop and control the d5 square, aiming for a solid pawn structure often seen in French defense or queen's gambit declined setups. This move signals white's intent to control the center and prepare for further development, aiming for flexible setups often seen in openings like the queen's gambit declined or even transposing into other structures. This move develops a knight towards the center, preparing for kingside castling and maintaining flexibility by not committing the d-pawn immediately, keeping options open for various defenses like the queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares to support a central pawn push, often leading to the queen's Indian or Nimzo Indian defenses. This move, 3b6, prepares to fianchetto the queen's bishop to b7, a common strategy in defenses like the queen's Indian or English opening variations, aiming to control the long diagonal and contest white's central influence. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop to g2, creating a strong defensive structure and exerting pressure along the long diagonal. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to control the long diagonal and potentially support a queenside expansion while challenging white's fianchettoed bishop. Developing the bishop to g2 strategically fianchettos it, reinforcing control over the long diagonal and preparing for kingside castling, which is a common and sound approach in this English opening setup. This move, 5d5, boldly challenges white's central control and opens diagonals for black's pieces, aiming to seize the initiative in the queen's Indian defense. This capture on d5 opens the c-file for white's rook, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawn structure while also contesting the center. This move recaptures the pawn in the center, leading to a standard queen's Indian defense pawn structure and allowing black to develop their pieces harmoniously. Castling kingside now solidifies the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard developmental step in this English opening variation. This move solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares to castle, continuing the standard development of pieces in this queen's Indian setup. This move firmly establishes white's central pawn control, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and potentially restrict black's development in the queenside. This move reinforces the knight's central presence and prepares for future pawn advances in the center or on the queenside. This move prepares to support the central pawn advance with e4, aiming to create a more open game and pressure black's d5 pawn. This move resolves white's central tension and opens a diagonal for black's queen, but it also allows white to establish a strong pawn center with e4. This pawn recapture on c3 creates an isolated d-pawn for black while opening the b-file for white's rook, establishing a strategic imbalance with potential for both attack and positional advantage. This move strategically challenges white's central control and aims to simplify the position by offering an exchange of bishops, potentially creating favorable pawn structures for black. The queen's relocation to a4 centralizes the queen, develops it further, and pressures the c6 pawn while preparing to potentially attack along the a4-e8 diagonal or support a kingside attack. This move strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing for potential pawn pushes and reinforcing the central control after black's tactical capture and recapture on c3. This move develops the bishop to a square where it attacks the queen and potentially pins the knight if white can reinforce the g-file. This move reroutes the queen to a more active square on the c-file, preparing to challenge white's control and potentially support a queenside pawn advance. This pawn advance aims to gain central space and potentially attack the black queen, while also preparing to support a d5 pawn push later in the game. Castling reinforces the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a vital step in bringing more pieces into active play. This knight maneuver redirects forces towards the kingside, creating potential for threats against black's king and preparing for further pawn advances like f4. To gain space, this move exchanges a knight for a bishop, simplifying the position and removing white's active knight, which was eyeing the queenside and potentially looking to reposition to f5 or g4. By recapturing with the bishop, white exchanges a potentially passive bishop for black's active bishop, solidifying the pawn center and gaining a slight advantage in piece activity. This move removes white's powerful bishop from the c1-h6 diagonal, creating an unbalanced pawn structure and opening lines for black's pieces. This move wins the rook on a8, decisively giving white a material advantage, but it allows black's pieces to become more active. Black recaptures the rook, a common reaction when an opponent sacrifices material, aiming to equalize the material count and simplify the position. This recapture of the rook on a1 on the open a-file strengthens white's queenside pawn majority and aims to activate the rook towards the center. The knight's jump to c5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and central control, as well as prepare for potential tactical threats against white's rook on a1. This move seizes an unprotected piece and aims to disrupt black's coordination, though it leaves the white queen exposed to potential counterattacks. Black recaptures the rook, accepting material equality and aiming to exploit white's potentially exposed king after the pawn structure has been disrupted. This move sacrifices the queen for a rook and a pawn, but it may be insufficient compensation given black's improved pawn structure and active pieces. This move, Knave4, aims to create counterplay by challenging white's bishop and preparing to recapture the pawn on c7, while also improving the knight's central position. This move aims to activate the bishop and potentially exploit the exposed black king or create attacking chances on the kingside. This move aims to activate the queen and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure while preparing to contest the now open a-file. The rook now occupies the open d-file, a strategically vital central thoroughfare, to contest control and prepare for potential pawn advances or further piece activity. This move challenges white's rook on the a1 file and aims to disrupt white's attacking potential on the kingside by creating weaknesses. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, directly attacking black's pawn on a6 and aiming to disrupt black's coordination while potentially creating threats against the kingside. This move seeks to exploit the newly opened queenside diagonal by harassing white's rook and potentially creating counterplay against the exposed king. This move repositions the rook to the d-file, aiming to pressure black's isolated queen's pawn and potentially control the open file for further advantage. Black recaptures the pawn, but this creates an open a-file for white's rook and allows white to continue developing pressure with moves like Road 1. This move decisively wins material by exploiting the pin on the queen and the undefended rook, aiming to simplify into a winning endgame after white regains the sacrificed material. This aggressive pawn capture seizes material but opens lines for white's pieces, demanding careful defense of black's king. This forcing check on the black king aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially recover material or simplify into a favorable endgame. The king seeks refuge on the better protected side of the board, creating a slight defensive triangle for future king safety. This move forces black's king to the back rank, aiming to exploit the now vulnerable kingside and prepare for a mating attack by exposing the white king. This move repositions the king to a safer square, avoiding the immediate check and preparing to defend the g-pawn which is under attack. This rook retreat is a critical repositioning, preparing to support a potential knight advance to f3 or to contest the open c-file, while also preventing black's queen from re-entering the fray via a6. The rook now occupies the open file, preparing to challenge white's advanced rook and contest control of the critical 7th rank for future play. The king's relocation to g2 solidifies its position behind the pawns and prepares for potential complications on the kingside, while also offering some breathing room from the current central tension. This pawn advance opens the f-file for black's rook and aims to create immediate complications, potentially threatening the white king and creating dynamic counterplay despite the material deficit. This move is a tactical continuation, forcing the opponent's king to a more exposed square and aiming to exploit the open file with the rook. The rook on g5 is well placed, aiming to penetrate the black king's defenses, so the king must retreat to f8 to avoid immediate checks and potentially organize a defense. The rook aggressively penetrates to the 7th rank, threatening checkmate on g8 and creating powerful attacking pressure along the open file. This move forces the opponent's king to move and disrupts white's coordination, potentially opening lines for your remaining pieces. This move aims to reinforce the king's safety by creating a pawn shield, while simultaneously preparing to defend the g-file and potentially challenge black's active queen. This move opens lines for the queen and rook, potentially creating counterplay and threatening the white king by challenging the central control, and preparing to attack along the open e-file. This rook sacrifice aims to disrupt black's king's defense by forcing open the g-file and potentially creating mating threats against the exposed monarch. The king's centralizing journey begins, aiming to escape the compromised queenside and join the defense or counterplay. The king now ventures into the center to support the advancing g-pawn, a necessary risk to create a passed pawn. This move e4 ignites the kingside, aiming to shatter white's pawn shield and create dynamic counterplay by opening lines for black's remaining pieces. This pawn advance breaks open the kingside, creating critical attacking lines and aiming to exploit the weakness created by black's pawn push. This move delivers a crucial check, forcing white's king into a vulnerable position and preparing to exploit the open file on the a-file with the rook. This move repositions the king to safety behind the pawn chain while preparing to defend against black's aggressive rook check. This check forces the white king to the edge of the board, aiming to disrupt white's king safety and potentially set up further discovered attacks or mating nets with the rook. The king repositions to safety on g2, avoiding the perpetual check possibilities and preparing to support the central pawn push. This move is a strategic retreat, allowing the queen to avoid the immediate threats and regroup on a safer square, potentially supporting a central pawn advance or preparing for a defensive setup. This move initiates a decisive tactical sequence by forcing the black king into a checkmate threat, exploiting the compromised defensive setup and white's material advantage. This move sacrifices the queen in a desperate attempt to gain counterplay and avoid immediate checkmate, a common theme in severely lost positions where players seek to create complications. This exchange of queens simplifies the position, leading to a rook and pawn endgame where white's king is much more active and better placed to support the advance of the remaining pawns. The exchange of queens is complete, and white is now entering a rook and pawn endgame where their material advantage of a rook should be decisive, aiming to consolidate and push their passed pawns. This move exploits the vulnerable king's position, initiating a decisive sequence to force checkmate or significant material gain. With the material balanced, black's king must become more active to support the advance of the central pawns and fight for central control. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, supporting the pawn push and preparing to contest the remaining open files for potential endgame advantage. The rook's repositioning to the second rank aims to pressure black's pawns on the queenside and potentially create new attacking opportunities while preparing for a rook endgame scenario. This move repositions the king to a safer square, preparing to defend the g-pawn and potentially join the fight on the kingside or centralize. With white's king exposed and pawns advanced, black aims to activate the queenside pawns and create counterplay with the b-pawn, potentially threatening to advance further and support the remaining pieces. This move initiates a plan to control the queenside pawns, aiming to create a passed pawn on the b-file while simultaneously defending against black's central pawn advance. This move aims to activate the rook on the queenside, potentially creating passed pawns or engaging white's king in the endgame after the exchange of queens. This move aims to centralize the king, bringing it into a more active role in supporting the rook and potentially defending the pawn structure as the endgame develops. The rook on a5 is now a target, and black needs to decide whether to defend it, exchange it, or reposition the king to a safer square away from white's active rook. This pawn move advances to control more space on the kingside and prepares to potentially create a passed pawn, while also adding a layer of defense to the king. The black king needs to escape the current predicament of being exposed on the open squares. So this move seeks to reposition it towards the queenside where it can find more safety and potentially participate in defending the remaining pawns. The king is actively participating in the endgame, centralizing and supporting the pawn majority on the kingside. The rook's repositioning to the 7th rank aims to support the pawn advance and create potential mating threats against white's king. This pawn move exploits black's weakened queenside, aiming to simplify the position and convert the material advantage. This check forces white's king to an exposed square, opening lines for black's rook and potential counterplay against the weakened kingside pawns. This move develops the rook to a more active square on the 7th rank, supporting the potential advance of the kingside pawns and putting pressure on black's king. This move aims to activate the rook on the 7th rank, connecting it with the king's defense and potentially challenging white's central pawn structure. The rook now advances to the 5th rank, creating a passed pawn on the h-file and preparing to support its advance, while simultaneously tying down black's king and potentially creating mating threats. This rook move aims to activate the rook on the 7th rank, creating potential mating threats against the black king and supporting the advance of the b-pawn. This pawn advance creates a passed pawn that will be difficult for black to stop, aiming to escort it towards promotion. The rook advances to the 7th rank, reinforcing the potential passed pawn and aiming to restrict white's king's movement, creating new tactical possibilities. This move aims to secure the king's safety by bringing the rook to a more active defensive square on the 7th rank, preparing for potential king advances or further defensive maneuvers. With the black king now safely on f6, Black aims to consolidate their forces and prepare to activate the rook from a7 to support the central pawn majority. The king advances to a more active central square, preparing to support the queenside pawns and potentially assist in defending the kingside if necessary. The move 51 kg 6 aims to reposition the king to a more active and safer square, preparing to support the pawn on b5 and potentially contest the h-file if the opportunity arises. This pawn advance creates a passed pawn on the e-file, aiming to advance it further to the 6th rank and potentially become a decisive threat against Black's king. This rook move repositions the piece to defend the pawn and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, aiming to create counterplay or support an eventual pawn push for promotion. The pawn advances to h7, creating a passed pawn that is now just one step away from promotion, forcing Black to dedicate immediate resources to its containment. This move captures the pawn and creates a passed pawn on the 7th rank, significantly increasing White's winning chances by forcing Black to defend it. This endgame is now significantly simplified, and exchanging the remaining rooks leads to a king and pawn endgame where White's king is more active, giving White a decisive advantage. The game has reached an endgame where the material is equal, but White's king is more active and centrally located, offering better prospects for a mating attack. The move 55 kf5 aims to bring the white king towards the center to support the advance of the remaining pawns and prepare for the endgame, a crucial step after the rook sacrifice and exchanges. With the kings now in opposition and White's king positioned to support a passed pawn, Black's king must stay close to defend the pawn chain and prevent its advance. As seen with the king moving to the g7 square, the king now moves to the active e6 square, aiming to support the passed h-pawn and participate in the endgame with more influence. This move continues the endgame plan of consolidating the material advantage and forcing opposition, with the king aiming to simplify into a winning pawn endgame. This move aims to centralize the king, preparing to attack the remaining queenside pawns and support the passed pawn once it is created. With the opponent's king exposed and vulnerable, the move aims to centralize the king, creating a powerful attacking force to support potential pawn advances and hunt down remaining enemy pieces in the endgame. This pawn push, e6, creates a potent passed pawn that will become a serious threat to Black's king as White's remaining pieces coordinate their attack. With the opponent's king exposed, the Black king advances to support the e-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn that can become a decisive threat in the endgame. This move promotes the pawn to a queen, a fundamental endgame strategy of converting material advantage into a decisive force. The move aims to connect the king with the remaining pawn structure, preparing to support its advance towards the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, while also repositioning for defense against White's advancing king. The decisive move of promoting the pawn to a queen is a natural consequence of the pawn's successful advance and the overwhelming positional advantage White has achieved, culminating in the forced win.